In the late summer of 1845, a tenant farmer in Western Ireland could walk out to his fields at dawn and witness an absolute agricultural miracle. The morning air was pristine, presenting a landscape so stark and clear it seemed entirely free of visual noise. Across the rocky, marginal land, acres of green, thriving potato plants stretched toward the horizon. The leaves held no warning, not a single yellow or black dot to suggest natural decay. This was the crop that fed a booming population, the quiet engine of an entire society. But by that very evening, the reality would violently fracture. A farmer returning to those exact same fields would find the lush green foliage completely blackened, wilted, and collapsing into the earth. When they desperately dug into the soil to salvage their lifeline, they found that the tubers themselves had already turned into a foul-smelling, putrid mush. What looked like a sudden, inexplicable natural disaster was actually something much darker and far more systematic. It was a structural collapse, decades in the making. Without knowing it, an entire nation had walked into a genetic trap, and the clock had just run out. Millions of people were about to pay the ultimate price for relying on a biological masterpiece that secretly doubled as an execution chamber. But to understand how a civilization became fatally tethered to a single root vegetable, you have to look at the bait. And the bait was engineered thousands of years earlier in an environment where human survival was never guaranteed. Roughly 8,000 years ago, high above the cloud line in the Andes Mountains of modern-day Peru and Bolivia, wild potato plants grew scattered across the rocky, wind-swept soil at extreme altitudes. These were not the golden, starchy, comforting varieties you would recognize in a modern market. They were small, gnarled, bitter, and genuinely toxic. In their natural state, wild potatoes produce solanine and tomatine. These are glycoalkaloid compounds acting as chemical defenses against predators. Consuming these tubers raw was not just deeply unpleasant, it was lethal, causing violent, severe cramps, vomiting, neurological disruption, and in severe cases, death. The indigenous farmers living in these treacherous mountains had to figure out how to survive on a landscape that actively resisted cultivation. Through generations of careful observation and sheer necessity, they discovered something that would alter the trajectory of human history. They learned that if you soaked these toxic wild tubers in freezing, running mountain streams for several days, the cold water would slowly leach out a significant portion of the deadly glycoalkaloids. But that was only the first step of an ancient, rigorous chemistry. The farmers would then expose the soaked potatoes to the extreme temperature fluctuations of the high Andes. The tubers were left out to freeze solid in the bitter, sub-zero night air. The following morning, as the intense equatorial sun aggressively warmed the mountain slopes, families would walk barefoot over the thawing potatoes, physically stomping and squeezing the remaining toxic moisture out of the flesh. They repeated this grueling cycle of freezing, baking, and stomping for days, until what remained was a light, chalky, bone-dry block of pure starch. This creation was called chuño. It was entirely safe to eat, weighed almost nothing, and could be stored for a decade without rotting. It was an unparalleled logistical triumph, arguably the very first processed food in human history. Chuño allowed the Inca to project power across a vast vertical geography. It fed their armies during long military campaigns across unforgiving mountain passes, and it sustained their cities during inevitable years of lean harvests. The Inca built an entire agricultural science around the potato, cultivating over 3,000 distinct varieties, carefully adapting different colors, shapes, and genetic traits to thrive in specific microclimates and soil types. They understood that diversity was the ultimate insurance policy against collapse. But the people who would eventually introduce this crop to the rest of the world possessed absolutely no understanding of that insurance policy. When Spanish conquistadors tore through South America in the 1530s, they were blinded by the pursuit of gold and silver. They entirely dismissed the ugly, lumpy tubers that the conquered indigenous populations ate at every meal. When Spanish ships finally carried a few potato specimens back to the Iberian Peninsula around 1570, the European reaction ranged from profound suspicion to to outright theological horror. To understand this rejection, you have to understand the European mindset. Entire feudal systems, economies, and religious metaphors were built upon grain. Wheat, barley, oats, and rye grew upward, reaching toward the sunlight and the heavens. Bread was civilized. It was considered a literal gift from God. The potato, conversely, grew hidden in the dark, buried in the dirt. It was misshapen, covered in strange growths, and belonged to the nightshade family. The exact same botanical family as some of the most infamous and deadly poisonous plants known to European apothecaries. To a deeply superstitious society, this was no botanical coincidence. It was a divine warning. Rumors and panic spread far faster than the crop ever could. In parts of France, the potato was formally accused of causing leprosy, leading the Parliament of Besançon to outright ban its cultivation. In the Russian Orthodox Church, it was branded the devil's apple, a sinful, unholy root that corrupted the soul. Scottish Presbyterians aggressively refused to consume it, arguing with absolute theological sincerity that because the word potato did not appear anywhere in the Bible, God clearly never intended it for human digestion. For nearly 2 centuries, the crop languished in the margins of European agriculture, treated as a dangerous curiosity, grown only as an ornamental plant for its delicate purple and white flowers, or fed exclusively to livestock and the utterly destitute. It took the brutal pressures of constant warfare and the cunning psychological manipulation of desperate leaders to force a change. In Prussia, King Frederick the Great realized that a crop hidden securely underground could not be easily burned by invading enemy armies, unlike highly vulnerable fields of wheat. When his peasants violently resisted his orders to plant the strange tubers, Frederick reportedly resorted to an ingenious psychological war. He planted a royal potato field outside Berlin and stationed heavily armed guards around its perimeter. The unspoken message was immediate. Whatever was growing in that dirt was highly valuable. The peasants, driven by curiosity and perceived value, began sneaking in at night to steal the plants for themselves. Across the Channel in France, a military pharmacist named Antoine-Augustin Parmentier survived years in a Prussian prison camp eating almost nothing but potatoes. He returned to France in excellent health and dedicated his life to a relentless public relations campaign, hosting elaborate potato-centric dinners for the Parisian elite and convincing Queen Marie Antoinette to wear potato blossoms in her hair, slowly breaking down the continent's irrational fear. But while mainland Europe was slowly, cautiously adapting to the potato through royal trickery and elite endorsement, a far more dangerous dynamic was taking shape on the island of Ireland. The situation here was not driven by curiosity or fashion, but by systemic political subjugation. Under British colonial rule, the vast majority of Irish land was controlled by English and Anglo-Irish Protestant landlords, many of whom were absentees who never set foot on the estates they mercilessly drained for profit. The native Irish Catholic population was systematically stripped of property rights, inheritance, and political agency through a series of brutal penal laws. They were pushed entirely to the margins, forced to become tenant farmers on tiny, fractured plots of incredibly poor, rocky, and boggy soil. They worked the harsh earth in the freezing rain. The heavy dirt and dark mud permanently caked into the fibers of their coarse clothing, an inescapable physical mark of their grinding reality. Grain could not reliably grow in this wet, unforgiving landscape. And even if it could, the tenant farmers could not afford the plows, the horses, or the mills required to process it. But the potato asked for almost nothing. A family needed only a simple spade, some rain, and a handful of seed tubers. Astoundingly, a single acre of marginal land planted with potatoes could yield enough highly nutritious food to sustain a family of 6 for an entire year. Combined with a small amount of buttermilk to provide necessary fats and calcium, the potato offered a completely balanced human diet. Because of this unparalleled biological efficiency, the Irish population began to explode. From roughly 3 million people in 1700, the population surged to over 8 million by 1840. The potato had effectively built a massive demographic miracle on the absolute edge of starvation. But this logistical triumph harbored a fatal, engineered flaw. Unlike the ancient Inca, who diligently cultivated thousands of diverse strains to protect against unforeseen environmental threats, the tenant farmers of Ireland relied almost exclusively on a single, high-yielding variety known as the Irish lumper. This singular choice laid the foundation for the ultimate trap. When you plant a field of wheat, you are planting seeds, and every seed contains a unique genetic combination. But when you plant a potato, you do not use a seed. You cut up an existing potato tuber and bury the pieces in the earth. Every new plant that grows is a perfect identical clone of the parent. This meant that every single potato plant across every single field in every single county of Ireland was biologically identical. The entire food supply of a nation of 8 million people was a biological monolith. There was absolutely zero genetic diversity. The trap was set, perfectly primed for a trigger. If a pathogen could figure out how to bypass the cellular defenses of one single Irish lumper, it would simultaneously possess the exact key to bypass the defenses of every single potato plant on the island. The execution chamber was fully constructed. It was merely waiting for a spark. That spark arrived in the late summer of 1845, crossing the Atlantic Ocean hidden in the dark, damp cargo holds of merchant ships. It was a microscopic water mold called Phytophthora infestans. This pathogen was highly specialized, thriving in the exact cool, incredibly wet conditions that defined the Irish climate. When the microscopic spores drifted on the wind and landed on the leaves of the lumper, they met absolutely zero genetic resistance. The mold penetrated the cellular structure of the leaves, rapidly destroying the plant from the top down, before washing deep into the soil with the heavy rains to rot the tubers hiding below. The biological collapse was instantaneous and absolute. A farmer could look at a healthy green field at dawn and watch it dissolve into a blackened, putrid nightmare by dusk. The speed of the destruction defied human comprehension. Because there was no genetic variation to act as a firewall, the blight swept across the island with terrifying, exponential velocity. The air in western counties like Mayo, Galway, and Clare grew so thick with the nauseating stench of rotting vegetation that people had to tie rags across their faces simply to breathe. The food supply of an entire nation turned to toxic black slime in a matter of weeks. But 1845 was merely the opening tremor. What transformed a severe agricultural crisis into a demographic apocalypse was that the pathogen did not leave. It embedded itself in the soil and returned in 1846, exponentially worse than the year before. It returned again in 1847 and again in 1848. The entire structural foundation of Irish society collapsed under the weight of the biological failure. Families, who had absolutely no alternative source of calories, began to slowly, agonizingly starve to death behind the closed doors of their small cottages. They collapsed in the freezing mud of the roadside ditches, their bodies failing as they desperately chewed on grass, weeds, and tree bark in a futile attempt to silence the agony of empty stomachs. As severe malnutrition utterly destroyed their immune systems, secondary infections moved in to finish the brutal work. Typhus, cholera, and dysentery swept relentlessly through the weakened population. Government workhouses, designed with deliberate cruelty to be as unappealing as possible, were flooded with thousands of dying families, transforming into overcrowded charnel houses where disease spread unchecked. Starving men, their mud-stained clothes hanging loosely from emaciated, skeletal frames, were forced to perform back-breaking hard labor, building pointless stone roads that literally led nowhere, simply to earn a miserable wage that was barely enough to buy wildly inflated grain. The immense tragedy of the Irish famine was deeply compounded by deliberate, unyielding political indifference. This was not merely a natural disaster. It was a man-made horror, engineered by economic ideology. While the Irish Catholic tenant farmers were dying of starvation in the mud by the hundreds of thousands, the island of Ireland continued to produce massive amounts of food. Vast quantities of grain, butter, oats, and livestock were systematically exported out of Irish ports, shipped directly to England under the strict, armed escort of the British military. Charles Trevelyan, the senior British Treasury official, granted absolute control over famine relief, rigidly adhered to a laissez-faire economic philosophy combined with deep-seated prejudice. He viewed the catastrophic starvation not as a humanitarian emergency requiring immediate, unconditional intervention, but as a necessary market correction and the direct judgment of God upon a morally inferior, overpopulated people. Trevelyan actively restricted aid, terrified that providing free food would make the Irish lazy and dependent on British charity. His clinical, detached policies effectively weaponized a biological failure, ensuring that the maximum possible number of people would perish. Driven by absolute terror and the undeniable reality of extermination, those who could scrape together the fare fled the island in one of the most desperate mass migrations in human history. They crowded into aging, poorly maintained timber vessels that quickly earned the grim moniker of coffin ships. Crammed into dark, unventilated, deeply unsanitary cargo holds for weeks on the violent Atlantic Ocean, passengers died by the thousands from ship fever and typhus. Their bodies were unceremoniously carried up to the decks and thrown overboard into the freezing waters. By the time the acute phase of the Blight finally began to recede in 1852, the demographic landscape of Ireland had been permanently shattered. Roughly 1 million people had died of starvation and disease. Another million had fled the country, scattering across the globe to cities like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Toronto. Ireland's population dropped by an astonishing 25% in less than a decade, a demographic wound so incredibly deep that even today, nearly 2 centuries later, the population of the island remains lower than it was on that fateful summer morning in 1845. The survivors who stepped off those coffin ships carried with them nothing but the clothes on their backs and a profound, generational anger toward the British Crown. An anger that would relentlessly fuel Irish nationalist movements and fiercely reshape the political machines of the American cities they eventually came to dominate. Yet, despite engineering one of the most horrifying humanitarian disasters of the 19th century, the story of the potato did not end in the muddy mass graves of Western Ireland. The brutal, unavoidable lesson the world extracted from the famine was not that the potato itself was inherently evil or dangerous. The lesson was the terrifying vulnerability of a closed biological loop. The devastation of the Irish lumper forced a total reckoning in how humanity approached its food supply. It served as a violent awakening to the sheer necessity of genetic diversity. Agricultural scientists, botanists, and agronomists across Europe and the Americas realized they could never again allow a population to hang by a single genetic thread. They began aggressively crossing surviving potato strains, reaching back to the deep, diverse genetic reservoirs originally cultivated by the ancient Inca in the Andes. They established rigorous seed potato programs, intentionally breeding for resistance, resilience, and adaptability. The disaster that nearly erased a nation became the crucial catalyst for modern scientific agricultural defense. Driven by these new, resilient varieties, the potato aggressively conquered the globe. It was adopted by Russian peasants who eventually revered it as the second bread. Embraced by Chinese farmers who found it could easily thrive in steep, mountainous soils where delicate rice paddies completely failed, and integrated into the high-altitude farming cultures of East Africa. Today, the lumpy root that 16th century European clergymen once preached against is the 4th most important food crop on the planet. Producing over 300 million metric tons every single year, it holds together vast sectors of the global food economy. And surprisingly, its high-starch chemistry is vital to the manufacturing of biodegradable plastics, pharmaceuticals, and synthetic rubber. But the ultimate validation of the potato's extraordinary biological architecture occurred far away from the boggy soil of Ireland or the rocky peaks of the Andes. In 1995, aboard the space shuttle Columbia, NASA scientists successfully cultivated potato plants in orbit, making it the very first vegetable ever grown in the absolute zero-gravity vacuum of outer space. As humanity looks toward the daunting prospect of long-duration space travel and the eventual colonization of other worlds, the criteria for a survival crop remain ruthlessly strict. It must grow in highly mineralized, poor soil. It must demand minimal water. It must store perfectly for long durations. And it must produce the maximum possible amount of essential caloric and nutritional energy per square inch of cultivation. The identical qualities that allowed a toxic, bitter weed to survive the freezing, oxygen-thin heights of the South American mountains 8 millennia ago make it the undisputed leading candidate to feed the first human beings who will eventually step foot on the Moon or Mars. The crop that was ignored by conquerors, feared by empires, and tragically misused to collapse an entire nation has transcended its dark history. The ultimate genetic time bomb has evolved into humanity's most vital insurance policy, proving that even the most perfect survival machine must respect the relentless rules of nature, from the muddy fields of the past to the furthest reaches of the stars.